I'd like to introduce Professor J. Crisostomo. He is an Assyriologist researching language and social and intellectual histories of the ancient Middle East. His forthcoming book, Translation as Scholarship, Language, Writing, and Bilingual Education in Ancient Babylonia, will soon be published in early 2019. He is currently working on the linguistic and social history of the Sumerian language, one of the world's earliest and most important recorded languages. Please join me in welcoming Professor Crisostomo.
Thank you very much, Professor Ali. So basically what I'm going to do today is just talk a little bit about my process thinking about language issues, or another way I'm going to title this is writing in another patois, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So primarily, we're going to focus on a couple main questions for today. Namely, how does my, and by my, not just me, but all of us, my research methodology affect how I write? And secondly, how do I introduce my audience to new complex concepts that I might take for granted? So we're going to talk a little bit about methodology, a big buzzword, so to speak, that maybe we don't always define very well, how that relates to our audience when we're writing, and in particular my own story in trying to weave together numerous techniques and tools and methodologies into a grander narrative that was my book. So first of all, Professor Ali kind of alluded to it a little bit, but I want to give you a little bit better introduction to who I am, what I do. So first of all, I call myself an Assyriologist. An Assyriologist is kind of an odd term, but we'll hold on to it for now. Basically, it means somebody who researches, studies, thinks about, lives with the languages and cultures of the ancient Middle East, particularly ancient Mesopotamia, which is more or less modern Iraq, modern Syria. And you'll see some of the materials I worked with here. If you don't mind, I don't really like the sound of my own voice for 45, 50 minutes, so I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth with you guys. So anybody seen things like this before? May you describe it? Oh, yes. So, well, let's see if anybody else can first, and then I'll describe it for you. So, any ideas?
Are they cuneiform tablets?
They are cuneiform tablets. So, yeah, these are clay tablets. I've got 3 of them up here, right? So one really big one with 4 sides to it, you can't really tell. One, medium-sized one, it's about this big. That's the one here on the bottom, and then another one up there. And so these are the kinds of objects that I work with, where somebody has taken a reed stylus and impressed it into wet clay to write. So these are my objects, and the people who write them are my people, so to speak. So I deal primarily in this cuneiform writing system. You can see this kind of wedge-shaped writing here. It's got like a triangle and a little tail on it. And primarily in multiple languages, but especially languages Sumerian, which was one of the world's first recorded languages, and another language we call Akkadian, which is related to Arabic, Hebrew, Ethiopic, some of these other languages that we are more familiar with. I work primarily on language, so I invoke a lot of theories about language, think about language a lot. What does it mean when people communicate with each other or talk to each other or write to each other? What do people try to do with that? As well as social and intellectual history. So as part of what I do, that means I'm working in things like linguistics, or things like anthropology, or sociology, or the history and philosophy of science. So I'm bringing to my work all of these different fields and ideas from all of these different fields. And that's going to be part of what I talk about today. Just a quick plug, I teach all sorts of courses, mainly on the ancient Middle East. So this term I'm teaching a course with a title I'm extremely proud of, which is Madness, Medicine, and Magic in the Middle East. Basically a history of medicine in the Middle East from ancient Babylonia to the present day. I also teach courses on language and writing in the ancient world. I have another course, Love, Sex, and Marriage in ancient Mesopotamia. And I teach and I've got a course in the winter term on science and technology in the ancient Middle East. So just a quick plug as you start thinking about courses for next term or in the future. And for those of you who are graduate students, I'm also teaching a course on changing climates in the ancient world next term as well. So that will be a seminar that we can think about. So again, we've got all of these different ideas, different theories that I'm working with and trying to then craft into a cohesive narrative, which was in my book, as Professor Ali mentioned, which will be out in 2019. And I'm only showing this because we'll talk about this process, my story, for some of the time here. So one of the issues then in writing, in thinking about research, is we have a major problem, right? We've got, on the one hand, our research, which relies on certain expectations, certain assumptions that we hold in our heads, so to speak. And on the other hand, we've got an audience that we're writing to, an audience that has their own potentially different expectations, different assumptions. So the issue at hand is how do we bring them together for our books, for our research, so that we have something for them to take hold of. So as we think about this, becomes a problem of methodology. This is a big M word. It gets thrown out, all the time in journal articles, right? Somebody will have a methodology section, or if you sit down with your thesis advisor or somebody like that, or a professor you're writing a paper for, and they'll say, well, what's your methodology on this? So I'm curious what you guys think. When you hear that term, methodology, what are you thinking about? What comes to mind for you?
Well, I think what comes to mind for me is mostly the fact that it was never clearly explained during
Right.
undergrad.
Good, yes. And that's part of our problem, right? We're a little bit hazy on what exactly this M word means. Any other thoughts or comments?
The way I read it is be explicit about how you're going to do things.
Great, yes. Being specific about how you're going to do things. Good, and that's actually kind of where I'm going to go with it. So for me, when I think about methodology, and when I talk to my students about methodology, I say methodology is the tools and questions you use to answer your research questions, right? So you're always taught you had to have a thesis and to have questions that get at your thesis. So methodology is how you go about it, right? So, if you purchase a chair from IKEA and it has this little section of pictures that shows you, you're going to need a ruler and you're going to need a hammer and you're going to need a screwdriver. In some sense, that is akin to what we think of our methodology. What are the things you're going to need to accomplish your research goals? Methodology directs and frames your research and writing. You can't write on everything. You can't research everything. Methodology is a way to kind of direct it and shape it in the way you want it to go. It's not so it's not so open-ended that you end up floundering or you just have endless data points. Whatever you determine to be your tools and questions helps guide how you analyze the data, helps you reflect and interpret your data, and that's all very important for us when we do research. An important point about methodology. Sometimes it's subconscious. and sometimes it's earned knowledge. And I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about this and the problems involved. So we internalize this knowledge, we internalize this methodology. So if it's subconscious, what are some of the implications of that for our research and writing?
Is it understanding our own biases?
Yes, that's certainly a big part of it. Yeah. So if we have our own biases, how does that shape how we present our research?
I think maybe one bias is, especially for if you're studying something in the past, one of the major biases is presentism.
Yeah,
Where
absolutely.
your own experience in the present with technologies that we have, with philosophies that we live by, you could very easily project that into a time where that's not relevant at all.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really easy to do. And I experience this a lot, both in my own work or in reading some of my colleagues' work, where there is an unstated assumption that the way we do things might be the way they do things, or other assumptions such as everything we have is everything that they had in the past, for example. So when we have these subconscious methodologies, we don't always recognize how that frames our research. And it's imperative on us when we're presenting our research to be very clear about that for our audience, so that we start to have some of the same expectations. And that's a tricky thing. It means sitting down and trying to figure out who you are as a person, how you are asking these questions, or why you're asking the questions you're asking. And I'll say this, your writing is at its most tenuous when you are unaware of your own assumptions. It means you can be less clear. It means you might say something or interpret something that your readers won't have any clue about why you're reading it or interpreting it that way or presenting it in that way. And in order to get at that, it's important to keep asking that question, why? So, we always have this joke, right, with toddlers, that all they'll do is ask their parents, why? Why does this work? Why does this happen? Why is it this? Why? As researchers, we shouldn't let go of that, right? We need to constantly be asking ourselves, why? Why do I think the way I think? Why do I expect the data to do this? Why do I expect this group of people to do that? And the more we ask that question, the more our subconscious ideas, our subconscious methodologies can come to the surface, and then we can start to examine them and analyze them more specifically. Kind of opposite of subconscious methodology, subconscious knowledge, is earned knowledge. And what are the challenges with earned knowledge as far as research, or more importantly, presenting that research to an audience? Actually, let me back up. What do you think I mean by earned knowledge?
Knowledge you gained through like school and education.
Yeah. So, if you go to a class and you take, intro to sociology, for example, or, you're in a seminar at CMENAS and you start to pick up tips on how to write or research. That's all earned knowledge. So what becomes the challenge then when you have something that's an earned knowledge? I don't even know if you can actually make it a noun like that, but if you have earned knowledge and you take that methodology and try to put it into practice for your writing and research, what are the challenges? Yes, sir.
You might be expected to present in a particular mold.
Yeah. That's absolutely a problem, right? So when you have this earned knowledge, you start to come out of yourself a little bit. You take on something of a mask and try to be something that maybe you're necessarily not. What other challenges might be presented with earned knowledge? Yes?
It also shows where you, like, who is informing you or teaching you. So if you're only educated at one institution, you're only getting that side of it.
Yeah, certainly. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it is something that you have to acknowledge. Great. One other result of earned knowledge is that sometimes you get a little excited about something that you've learned, right? And that might lead to a tendency to over-explain in your writing. Or maybe to try to jump too much into this other mold of writing, this other mold of research. And it makes your writing very stilted or very opaque for your readers. So those are things we need to consider when thinking about this internalized methodology that we have. So jumping back to defining methodology and thinking about it, one of the most important questions that you have to think about when writing a book in particular, but an article or a research paper or presenting to an audience, is does your audience share your methodology? And sometimes they will, right? So if you are presenting to a group of literary theorists and you're thinking about a poem, sometimes you'll have that shared language to build off on. You'll be able to talk about things like, stanza and stanchion and prose versus poetry and all these other things that you go to specific conferences like the MLA for. And people will be on board, and you don't have to go through this whole process of talking about here's what I'm going to talk about and how I'm thinking about it. Conversely, if your audience doesn't share your methodology or is only shares your methodology in part, again, those are different challenges. So that means when you're writing, when you're researching, when you're preparing to present your research, you have to think about your audience. Who is your audience? What do they know? What do they expect? And how much can you realistically expect them to understand? So, in light of all these questions, and you're going to find I like questions, I'm big on questions, I want to walk you through a little bit my process in writing. So, as I started thinking about my book, as we all should be doing, I came up with this question. And namely, that was, what does translation mean? So, my group of texts are word lists, which sounds extremely boring, but and they kind of are. But I like to think of it in a different way and frame it differently. So these word lists would occasionally, very, very occasionally, introduce translations. Otherwise, they were simply monolingual word lists. Like if we think about it in English, if you just get a list of things like apples, lead, churches, very small rocks, cherries, like those don't really mean a whole lot by themselves. But then, of course, if you have a bilingual word list or you introduce translation, that means something else, right? Or a context. So my big research question was, what does translation mean? And I am arguing that translation is part of a scribe establishing his scholarly credentials. It's a way for ancient Babylonian scribes to say, hey, look, I know what I'm doing with this writing system we're trained in, with these languages we're trained in. I can do special things with them. That's why I call it translation as scholarship. But in order to answer this question, I had to think about what tools do I need to answer it. And so I came up with more or less a broad list. Philology. Philology is an Assyriologist's bread and butter, right? That's the thing we all think about when we think about language work. where you think about grammar and knowing the meanings of vocabulary words and being able to put it all together and think about what does a text mean and things like that. That's kind of the ruler in our toolbox, so to speak, to get us to build the IKEA chair right. So I needed that. I needed historical discipline. Professor Ali mentioned earlier that it's easy for us to project back into the past our expectations of the presentism. Or in my field, one problem is it's really easy to think of 3,000 years worth of history of ancient Iraq as a singular entity, as a monolithic thing that doesn't really change. So one of the tools I needed was to be a little bit more localized and examine what's going on in a particular time, a particular place. Other tools I decided I needed was sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology. And I'll come back to this in particular. But this is a whole nother field. Because I'm dealing with language, because I'm dealing with translation, I needed to think a little bit differently than I would think as a philologist, than I would think as a historian. I also needed some sociology, and for me that was what was most useful was Bourdieu's practice theory. So I had to think about, okay, how do I work that into this book? And finally, semiotics, this whole notion that signs mean stuff. So I had to sit there and think, okay, how in the world do you take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 really big topics on which hundreds of articles and books have been written and condense it down in a way that's useful for my audience, in a way that they'll understand what I'm trying to argue and doesn't completely overwhelm them? Well, I went back to those questions that we were thinking about before, like who is my audience? What can I realistically expect them to understand? So, of these tools that I had, that I needed, what does my audience already know? I figured, okay, my audience, I'm writing primarily to people in my field, Assyriologists. I figured, okay, they'd be good with the philology part, right? I could talk about grammatical things, without necessarily sitting down and explaining it to them. They'd be more or less okay with the historical discipline part. I could say, this is what I'm going to cover, this is what I'm examining. They'd get that. But the rest of it, sociolinguistics, linguistic anthropology, Bourdieu's practice theory, semiotics, all of that would be way beyond their realm of understanding or their realm of assumed knowledge. I would have to give them that. And still, we're at these disciplines that are extremely diverse, they're somewhat complex, but they allow me to nuance my argument. And so I'll talk a little bit about how I went about that, but I want to focus in especially on sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology and how, in my book, I went about trying to inform my audience or give them the same tools that I had without overwhelming them. Which is why I want to think about this as writing in another patois. A patois is a sociolinguistic term, which basically means a specialized language for a group of people. That could be a dialect, it could be a trade language, it could be the jargon used in, a particular warehouse or something like that. And the issue that we come up with is, how do we write for one group of people using the specialized language of another group of people? Or specifically for me, how do I write for Assyriologists using the tools and the language of sociolinguistics? So I had to think about this in how to craft it. One important way is your structure. So as I said, we had those, I gave you that list of 6 completely different disciplinary methodologies that I had to invoke in my writing, you can't just throw it all at them at once, right? That's going to be completely overwhelming. You can't just, for a book in particular, you can't just do a methodology section or a methodology chapter and say, well, here's everything I've got. Now you guys have to get on board. So one of the ways I went about this is to try to introduce these concepts gradually through my structure. So I devoted a whole chapter to the concept of language. In that chapter, I introduced semiotic theory. So I was starting to talk about how do signs mean, and think about, people like Charles S. Peirce or Ponte or all these other figures who have thought about signs and meaning and this concept of meaning. And I tried to introduce very small, bite-sized chunks for a very big field to my readers. In another chapter, I dealt with education, and in particular, how Bourdieu's practice theory, so we come to the sociology part, how Bourdieu's practice theory helped me understand this education, that is, this social field, to use a Bourdieuianism, of education that I was dealing with. And so that's where I introduced some of this, again, a very, very complex methodology and a set of tools. But I'm trying to do it slowly and not just say, here's everything. And then I had another chapter where I introduced the concepts of sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology for my readers. So again, that they can absorb these different ideas in small bite-sized chunks and not choke to death on them, if I continue the metaphor. Another important aspect in being able to write in another patois is read in these other fields, so that you can somewhat embody these other researchers, or get a sense for how do they explain their own ideas, or learn from their mistakes. How are they very bad at understanding their subconscious methodologies? And the more you read, the more you can feel comfortable speaking in these ways, and the more that will come out to your readers. It's not a forced, stilted thing that they're constantly thinking, oh, you're just pulling a bunch of block quotes from so-and-so researcher, or you don't really understand what you're doing. And the more you read, the more you can understand these methodologies. And finally, an important aspect of this was clarity and curation. I'm going to dive into this a little bit more specifically. You can't introduce these whole fields to your readers, right? Like I said, for some of these fields, you're talking about 2,000, 3,000 years worth of back history, or 200 years worth of real intense theory, right? Or even, you think about a field like gender studies, like that's exploded in the last 30, 40 years, and you can't cover everything. So you have to sit and curate and identify the essentials. What are the aspects of these methodologies, of these tools, that are going to be most essential for your particular argument? And you have to define those terms. Again, you can't define everything. So you have to choose, 1, 2, 3 particular terms that you're going to use and be very productive in your usage of them. And you have to define them and give them examples of how these terms work in the abstract, that is in the fields that you're pulling them from, and more concretely for your readers in the field that they're more familiar with. So for me, I would, introduce an example related to crafting a linguistic identity. That is, people use language to make themselves part of a particular group or differentiate themselves from another group. And that was one thing I zeroed in on as an important concept for my readers to have. So I gave them an example, a well-known example by Professor Penelope Eckhart, who went into a high school back in the late 90s and observed how two different groups, the jocks and the burnouts, used language to differentiate themselves from each other. That they had these particular turns of phrase or these particular these particular phonological changes or variations in their language that were unique to the burnouts or were unique to the jocks and made them two very different social groups. So I gave my readers that example, and then I zeroed in on a particular example in my corpus that was very useful for my argument, and said, okay, so we've talked about the jocks and the burnouts in this Bay Area high school from 1996, but what does this methodology mean for ancient Babylonian scribes in 1750 BCE who are writing in multiple languages? So you can extrapolate from the jocks and the burnouts and start talking about Babylonian scribes who are writing most often in Sumerian, but occasionally in Akkadian, and think about the implications of that. So examples are really important for kind of guiding your readers along into this new broad world of different methodologies. And finally, you have to actually start to use all of these concepts in your narrative, as part of your argument. You can't just introduce these ideas and concepts and just say, well, it's all in the background, right, of what I'm doing. You have to be very intentional about bringing these concepts into your writing. Now that you've introduced them, you get your readers kind of used to these concepts as you're using them and framing them as part of your narrative. You keep coming back to them. You keep coming back to these different terms that you've introduced and using them in very specific ways to get your audience to start thinking like you. And that's very important. The whole point of this is to bring your audience in some ways inside your head. Because when they're in there and they understand how you're thinking and how your methodologies are driving your argument, how you're interpreting your data based on the tools that you're using to answer questions, then they're inside your head and they're starting to understand and will start to buy into what you're selling them, into your argument. And so it's a huge challenge to bring an audience along with you in your writing. But it's something that we have to do, and it's something that is absolutely necessary for us both to be good scholars and honest scholars, but also just good communicators, good writers, who don't bore our audience, but at the same time, who don't lose our audience. So that's basically the ideas that I wanted to present to you today, and a little bit of my own story, but I'm happy to, of course, talk about things in more detail or think through some of these ideas and concepts with you more specifically. So thank you. Any thoughts, questions, ideas?
So I guess I'm just wondering, with this process of writing your book, this is a culmination of several years of research, and in that process, you probably were writing to different audiences or had different versions of this research and showed it to different individuals, different groups. And so maybe if you could talk about maybe the different iterations of your research.
That's a really, really
how you shape, the audience and how that affects the work that you're producing. And then how do you get it to this final stage?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great and important question. So it comes back to that whole idea of identifying your audience, right? Which can be a tricky concept because, as Jessica said, you're sometimes writing for multiple audiences simultaneously. So, I claimed to the publisher, well, I'm writing to a Syriologist, that was easy, but people who are interested in translation might dig this, or historians will be interested in this, or sociolinguists or anthropologists might be interested in this. So you also have to write with them in mind. But at some point you have to narrow it down to saying, well, this is the primary group I am going to write for. And for me, this book actually started as my dissertation, and I actually had no intention whatsoever of publishing it in that form. So it started out life as a book with a good audience in mind, not just my dissertation advising committee, but very much for people in my field. Various circumstances changed, and I had to actually publish the thing, and I tried to craft it in a slightly different way. So that very first finished product was very distinctively an Assyriological book. In its current iteration, it attempts to be a little bit more broadly focused and speak to people who are thinking more about language in general. And yet, I didn't really change a whole lot of it. I introduced some other concepts more gradually. I introduced a lot more examples for my readers so that they could still kind of come along with me on this process. But it is a challenge to write to multiple people, multiple audiences. But yeah, ultimately you have to kind of pick, who is that one person that you're trying to reach, or that one group of people that you're trying to reach, and write primarily for them and understand what their expectations are. And maybe you can try to write with another minor group in mind. But if you start trying to write for, 5 completely different audiences, you're going to get pulled in too many directions, and it's going to tear apart your book, or your paper or whatever. So I ultimately, I'll tell you this, I spent 3 years between finishing the dissertation and actually sending the manuscript off to the publisher of wrestling with that very issue of who in the world am I writing for. And I rewrote things like the introduction a dozen times, trying to get at too many different audiences, until finally I settled in on, okay, this is the kind of person I think will be most interested in this book, and I'm going to write to them and let it be. And ultimately what that meant was I didn't change as much as I thought I was going to change, or that the versions of the book went through, which were a lot more changed than the final version compared to the dissertation. So does that kind of get at? Good.
Did you submit any journal articles in the meantime that were sort of testing out ideas and sort of what audiences were in mind?
Yeah, I did send out a few journal articles, but again, to very specifically Assyriological audiences, so people in my field. I went to several conferences, again, mostly to people in my field, but I did test it outside a little bit and got some decent feedback there. And in those instances, it was very helpful to see where my examples were falling flat, where I could see where different audiences had different expectations, and they could nod along with me more easily for, when I talked about, language in a particular way, like semiotics. So if I were presenting to a group of philosophers, I didn't need to talk in more detail about semiotic theory and Ludwig Wittgenstein as I would to my department, for example. Or if I were talking to sociologists, I could be a little bit more bold and going with my ideas on Bourdieu, because they already understood those basics. But a big part of that is then this whole notion of you really have to know your audience to know how much you can push them and know how much they're willing to accept in order to buy into your argument. Yes.
So like personally, I feel like I'm kind of like being very much introduced to like this world of academia and high level like thesis and dissertation writing, between like this class and like I'm currently starting my own like honors thesis. And something I've been struggling with this idea of audiences is where you draw the line between like being realistic about who is going to read your work and being exclusive and elitist and kind of excluding those who might not be at the same education level or privilege level.
Yeah, that's a big point. There's an excellent book that that we should all look at is William Germano's book, Getting It Published. Is that the one I'm thinking of? He's got two important books. One is Getting It Published, and the other is From Dissertation to Book. So yeah, the Getting It Published one. And he talks a lot about audience. And one of the things that stands out to me is he says a scholarly book without a scholarly audience is no book at all. And so, yes, at some point you do have to make that distinction. Are you writing for the general public? And if so, you still have to kind of pick out, well, who are the people I'm writing for in the general public? And yes, unfortunately, that does sometimes lead to being elitist. And it's an unfortunate aspect of this. Now, you could actually flip that around and say, well, no, I'm not going to write to the elitist. I'm not going to write from an elitist perspective. I'm going to try something else. But you get into other sorts of trouble doing that, right? Because no matter what, all of us in this room are elite. We are privileged. We're privileged in different ways, certainly, but there's no getting around the fact that being at the University of Michigan, even for a day or two, gives us a certain kind of elitism that in some ways prevents us from actually having a good voice for people who are less privileged than we are. And I'm still honestly not sure how to get around that. Because, especially in the US in its current climate, there is a divide between, or there is a perception that people who are elite don't understand others. And there's a little bit of animosity between that because of that divide as well. And how do we who are privileged get outside of ourselves, so to speak, in order to, but for what end, right? To there's a sense in which if you're trying to write for a particular kind of audience, you're still trying to make them like you. And that becomes a problem. Yeah, sorry, I'm kind of talking off the top of my head on some pretty big issues here, but it's very much important for you to consider, who it is you're talking to and do what you can to understand that perspective and write to that in whatever ways you can. But thank you, that was an incredibly important question.
So at the beginning portion of your talk, you had that list of different fields that you wanted to include, their methodologies. I'm curious to hear how you really found your footing in those fields enough so that you felt as though you could introduce them to other readers.
That's great. I should have talked a little bit about that more. So part of that is my, part of being a graduate student, part of being in higher education is you have that opportunity. Now you'll notice I'm very, very careful not to call myself a linguist. I'm very, very careful not to call myself a historian because I don't feel I've earned that right. but I feel I can say I research language and I research history, and I have had some degree of training in those fields. So part of it is talking to, learning from people that are around you. One of the great things about the International Institute is you can dive into all sorts of different programs and units and learn from them, and talk to colleagues, both your immediate colleagues here in CMENAS or colleagues in these fields that you want to try to broach into, and learn from them. And then the other side of it is you read, and read a lot. It's not an easy prospect. It's one of my own personal struggles with being in the Department of Middle East Studies, which is namely an area studies unit, right? Which means we all study the same more or less geographic region, but we don't share the same methodologies. We don't share the same data. Not all of us, at least. We're coming at the same geographic region more or less from extremely different perspectives. And what does that mean for us as a unit? But on the other side is that still that ability to converse with numerous colleagues. So for example, Professor Ali, he's a lot more literary oriented than I am myself. And he and I can have a conversation about comparative literature and think about things like the Arabian Nights and the Epic of Gilgamesh together, and think about, okay, how are we thinking about these different pieces of literature from different times and spaces, from different social groups. And I admit I would tend to bring a more social historical perspective to it, and he would probably bring something more literary value, and think about themes and motifs. And I would say, yeah, well, scribes did this, but that's very useful. So one of the things I would say to that is there's a big difference between being an academic and being an intellectual. And I would urge you to be an intellectual, which means to me that you go after learning, you go after knowledge, and you don't confine yourself to particular definitions of what people expect you to be. So you go after what you need to do your research, and sometimes that means going into all sorts of different fields and exploring and learning and thinking with other people and talking with other people to get a sense for exactly the same thing we've been talking about. Get a sense of, to know how do they do what they do, and how does what they do. Let me see if I can phrase this right. How does knowing how they do what they do help what I do? That was pretty good, actually, so let me say that again. How does knowing how they do what they do help what I do? And yeah, you get enough of it. And like I said before, you read, you can start to feel comfortable to teach it. And ultimately, that's what we're doing when we're writing and trying to bring our audiences into our heads. We're teaching. So we're trying to incorporate some of the pedagogy, I am at least, trying to incorporate some of the things that I do as a teacher into my writing and say, all right, I know almost nothing, or at least 3 years ago, I knew almost nothing about prophetic medicine in 19th century Egypt. But I co-taught this course on medicine in the Middle East with a colleague, Professor Anna Vinaya, whom some of you probably know. She taught me a lot. She gave me a bunch of stuff to read. I listened to her when she gave her lectures, and I'm willing to give it a go, in my own class by myself, because I've been able to learn from her and learn from people she's directed me to. And even though I don't feel I'm an expert in it, at the same way that she is, she's given me enough of a foothold that I can sort of teach it. And it's the same kind of idea for writing a book. Professor Ali, you had something?
Yeah, I mean, being in the same department, I've had the pleasure of reading and reviewing your work, especially last year. And one of the things that stands out to me about your work is the contemporary theory and approaches that you bring to your, as your methods. I mean, I don't know that much about your field, but it seems to me that semiotics and Bourdieu are new to your field, and that you're introducing this as a way of illustrating how these tools can be useful. I'm just wondering how, first of all, like, how do you make that work to a field that is unfamiliar with those approaches? And then the other is how do you adapt the methods to the historical and cultural context of ancient Iraq?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me deal with the second one first and then come back to the first. So one of the things with quote unquote using theory is something one of my anthropology teachers always taught me is you have to give back, right? So in some ways, when you are employing, when you're adapting, when you're theorizing with other data, it is an opportunity then for you to say, where does it work and where does it not? And you can kind of give it back to the fields of sociology, for example. So one of the brilliant things, and probably something I can talk to a little bit later on, is determining which methodologies you're going to need, right? So for example, why does Bourdieu's practice theory work for me? One of the things that's great about it is Bourdieu spends a whole lot of time thinking about education. And since that was the social group, the social world that I was working in, education, I was able to start seeing where what I was reading about Bourdieu worked even 3,000 years ago. So he talks a lot about the institutionalization of habits that we internalize because we are in school. So for example, think about when you're in high school, or even now, if you're given if you're told to write a final exam, probably 50% of us will go out and buy a blue book without being told to. Because we know we've been trained that's part of our habitus, so to speak. And we don't really question it, we just do it. And so that was very useful for me in thinking about why does translation do what I claimed it does. And so in that sense, I was able to add, in one way, another case study to Bourdieu's theory, while also still saying, I mean, it leaks in some places, and that's okay for what I'm trying to do. And that's also part of it. We want to be intellectually honest, but part of being intellectually honest means recognizing where some of the stuff we're doing is for our purposes, right? So some of the methodologies and I'm going to say this word very intentionally, some of the methodologies we appropriate, we do so to make our arguments work. But at the same time, if we read and read and read and really understand these other methodologies, we can better understand how and why they work they do, and kind of not appropriate them in inappropriate ways. So coming back to your first question then about how am I introducing these concepts to my field? It's not easy going. So if I could be a little bit honest about the state of the field of Assyriology, Assyriology has traditionally seemed to think that data is self-evident, and that's something I am very keen to get us away from. So I'm very fortunate, of course, to be in a position of being one of a relatively small handful of people who gets to shape the future of the field. I have a tenure track position at a big university in the United States. I am one of only 25 people in the United States to hold such a position, and I am currently the youngest of that lot. In fact, there hasn't been a position in my field since I got mine 4 years ago. So I'm in a very, and I feel this responsibility, I'm in the position of being one of a few people who can direct the field going forward. And so I feel it's very incumbent upon me to introduce these concepts to get us as a seriologist to recognize where our methodologies are driving our data, where our methodologies are driving our interpretations. Because even the notion that data is self-evident is a methodology. It is an assumption that people hold, and there are all sorts of other assumptions at work then. And so I'm trying my best to bring some of these assumptions to light. You know, I was talking earlier about this issue with our subconscious methodologies and our subconscious knowledge. And in my field, I think the more and more I demonstrate and be more than just more methodological, or bring all these other concepts to the field, I think I can live what's something that I think we as a field should be going forward. And like I said, it's not easy going. There are some colleagues who probably don't appreciate what I'm doing because I will say things like habitus, pulling from Bourdieu, or say that language ideology is something that, you know, is subconscious and it plays itself out when people write and communicate. Because again, that's bringing to the surface some of our deeply held beliefs and examining them in the cold light of day. And sometimes people don't appreciate that. And that's just the way it is. But I figure, well, I'm going to use my privilege for good in this instance. Yes.
I was wondering, how do you go about discovering these theoretical tools in fields that are outside of your own? Sometimes when I'm looking for a theory that might be helpful, I don't know where to start looking.
Yeah,
So is it just, go ahead.
That's a great question. I was very, very lucky as a graduate student because my training was intentionally more broad. So I was trained by two Assyriologists who are not like everybody else, and they were very open to the concept of bringing in other methodologies and thinking bigger than the data is self-evident. So I was very fortunate in that, and because of that, I just read. I was forced to read a lot, and I took it upon myself to take courses or to get reading lists from other disciplines. And so when I started doing that and I started talking to other people about, here's what I'm trying to do, they could give me hints, give me ideas, and say, you know, why don't you check out this article or this book, or talk to this person on campus. And eventually I was very, very fortunate that on Berkeley's campus where I was, there was somebody who worked on Mayan language, and he also adapted Bourdieu's practice theory for some of his concepts of language as a social phenomenon. And so I took multiple classes with him. I sat down and talked to him a lot. He served as on my committee. One of my other advisors, she was very philosophically oriented and absolutely brilliant. And she constantly gave me stuff to read. And my advisor, my primary advisor, was very, very receptive to all of this. And so all of that kind of came together and helped me find the tools I needed. And like I said, part of that is circumstance of, one of my primary advisors was well versed in some of the stuff that I ended up taking and applying. And maybe, and I mean, that's a big part of it. It's just an honest part of my training that therefore this is who and what I am, but it also works. So yeah, I mean, it's my answer for a lot of this stuff is just gonna come down to you read a lot and you get lucky. So, and talk to people. Yeah, those three things will usually help you find the tools that you need to get at your argument.
I guess, so lately I've been thinking a lot about public scholarship.
Mhm.
So I think one of the great things about Radcliffe Graduate School is they have an office of public scholarship, and they offer a lot of trainings for graduate students to think about taking your research and presenting it to different audiences. And with what we do at the center as well, we have a lot of projects where we are teaching about the Middle East to K-12 teachers, to other community members. And so I'm just wondering, in the work that you do, have you been thinking about like a public-facing component, and making the work that you do more accessible? Sort of as a scholar and a researcher, how do you gain those skills to make your work accessible?
Thank you. That's another really important question. So to answer very simply, yes. Public scholarship is something that's very, very much on my mind. It's something that is very important to me as a scholar, as an individual. And I'm not that good at it. And so I am constantly asking the exact same questions you are of how to get better, how do you go about it. Again, part of it is luck. So, I have a Twitter feed. Part of it is you get a little lucky with a hashtag once, and suddenly you get 1,000 retweets and likes, and suddenly you get 1,000 more followers. I haven't been that lucky. Some of my colleagues have. Some of it is interacting with people who are really good at public scholarship. The ancient world in general can be less than ideal about public scholarship, but there are some incredible scholars out there who are fantastic at presenting the research of their field in ways that capture the public imagination, and I'm learning from them. So I think specifically about people like Professor Sarah Bond at University of Iowa, who is incredible at bringing the classics, that is Greece and Rome, into the public eye, dealing with issues that are in the public imagination already, such as the color of Greek statues and inherent racism that comes from the classics, or as is part of the legacy of classic scholarship. I learned from others in my field who are archaeologists, who are able to present their research in a way that people really take to. I spoke with Professor Ann Curzan here at LSA, who is herself a brilliant public scholar. She works primarily on English language. And I was very fortunate last autumn to take a little workshop with her on these very issues, to think about how to become better at it and how do you take advantage of the opportunities that are given to you. But I will say it's something that I'm thinking deeply about for us as a university, and more specifically for the Department of Middle East Studies, of that public scholarship needs to be a bigger component of our training for graduate students and for faculty. That because I think it's an essential aspect for us moving forward. So if we think about the Department of Middle East Studies or the Center for Middle East and North Africa, there's a sense in which we should be one of the very first places that people should be coming to with questions that are very, 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 very prominent in their minds. You know, let's face it, the political situation and a host of other issues are very relevant to these two units. And there is a sense in which we haven't taken advantage of that, or the public doesn't come to us for answers or to even think with them on some of these issues. Occasionally we'll put out statements. Occasionally, we might say something. But for reasons that I'm still trying to figure out and thinking through, we're not always the first people that a reporter will dial up to ask about these things. So one of the avenues that I'm thinking about for public scholarship, or one of the ways I keep thinking about it, is again this question of how do you speak to this broader audience? And one important aspect for me that I'm still trying to figure out how this actually works is how to be simple without being simplistic. Which is very important for us writing books too, by the way. But we have a little bit more leeway there to be complex. But for the broader public, there are times when we feel like we don't want to compromise on some of what we say, right? But some of our arguments are extremely nuanced and extremely complicated. And sometimes in order to present or to redirect a public conversation, we need to pull that back a little bit more and say, ultimately, here's what I'm trying to say. And maybe once they've engaged, then you can introduce all the extra bits and pedanticism that we like as academics. But it's a constant struggle for me personally to try to figure out how to do that. Yes.
I have two questions that are related to one another.
Great.
First is, what is the main thesis or argument of this book?
Mm-hmm.
And what would it take for you to say I was wrong?
What would it take for me to say I was wrong?
Yes.
That's a great question. I'll think about that one. So I'll deal first with the thesis argument. So the main thing that I'm arguing here is that the cuneiform writing system is loaded with potential. And scholars, students, scribes, as part of their education, begin to internalize the ability to take advantage of that potential, to create and innovate with the writing system. And one of the ways that they do that is in translation. So that when a student scribe writes that the sun god in one language, the word for the sun god, is translated by the word for donkey. I am arguing that things like that are not student errors. I'm arguing that those are in fact very intricate and innovative ways that the scribe is showing off, so to speak, and saying, look what I can do with this writing system, with these languages. And by the way, because I can do that, hire me, sort of thing, right? I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious on the hire me part, but I'm darn good at what I do because I can do it this way. What would it take for me to say I'm wrong? I'm wrong a lot. On the big issue of the big main thesis of this book, I think somebody would have to tear it apart at the very foundations, meaning that they would have to take apart each one of these tools that I use and say, either your tools are broken, you used the wrong things, and yeah, things along that nature. Otherwise, I'm probably good enough to say, yeah, well, you're just misreading it, or kind of say, maybe you're right in this instance, but on the whole, I'm bang on because I know this better than you do. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Now I'm really interested in your thesis.
Good.
I don't see that was probably just an example, but I
It
don't
was.
see the connection you made, or the scribe made, between sun god and donkey.
Yes. So that is a phonological
Okay.
argument.
What are
based-
the words? Like
yes.
the originals.
Perfect.
Okay.
So, bear with me. This gets a little fun. So the word for the sun god is Utu, which happens to sound a lot like the word for sheep in Sumerian, which is Udu. Udu, sheep, translated into Akkadian is Imarum. So that gets you from sun god to sheep in 3 steps. Imarum sounds like the word for donkey, Imerum. So in a 4-step process, you get from sun god to donkey with a little bit of translation in between there. So
Okay.
that's one of my favorite
way
examples.
cool.
And that's how it can show off as knowledge. I see it now.
Right, yeah. So you know, it's this way of knowing the languages and knowing what you can do with those languages and with the writing system to come out with, hey, in my eyes, the sun god is a donkey, or at least for this particular example.
Thank you.
Yep.
And I think for many of us who grow up in bilingual families, this is how my family laughed. I mean, we were constantly translating and mistranslating back and forth, and phonological similarities,
Mhm.
and that sort of thing. It's just sort of I think it's evidence of a vibrant, cosmopolitan, multicultural, multilingual society.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I'm very keen on to prove, and this is where somebody can actually start to say, no, never mind. I think I've actually proven this pretty well, that it's more than just like having fun with language, but rather it's very, very intentionally done. Like I said, for in this social group, to demonstrate how good you are with it. Right. So yeah, for families at the dinner table, it's a whole lot of fun to be able to go back and forth like this, or you get it in movies and things. But in a particular institutionalized setting, I am saying it's more than play. It's intentional.
Did you grow up multilingual?
I wish I did. I had the opportunity to, and I decided very young, growing up in the Midwest, not near an urban center, that I wanted to shun that part of my identity. And I regret it.
I wondered how then that affects the fact that you're doing translation just with languages that are extinct, I assume.
They are extinct, yeah. It probably does, to some extent. I do think I would probably have much better insights to this if I were multilingual myself. Unfortunately, beyond the ability to read in multiple languages, I don't speak it, I don't think it. And that's my bad. But working in extinct languages is kind of a way to get around that. So I'm multilingual with extinct languages, maybe.
And do you think being growing up monolingual actually helped you not fall into the trap of presentism?
Well, that's the first time I've ever thought of it as a really, really good thing.
The trap of what?
Presentism.
Presentism.
I don't know. I think it makes me very aware of the issues that second-generation immigrants, or in my case, first-generation immigrants and children go through in constructing identities based on language. And that is a big part of what I argue. or how I think about the ancient world also is the way that people with learned languages, in particular, how they construct identities and do these things with purpose to differentiate themselves. So in my case, it was to shun my mother tongue, so to speak, or my mother's tongue, because it's not my mother tongue. So to shun Filipino, to speak only English, was a way to differentiate myself and to construct an identity of, hey, I'm just like everybody else around me. Again, I regret it now, but that was what I did as a kid. And so I am very aware that people use language in those kinds of ways. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah. Please.
So this is perhaps more topical. So I guess language and identity. And correct me if I'm wrong. Anyone in the room can correct me if I'm wrong. But apparently you were Greek if you knew how to speak Greek, as you're Arab now. You just speak Arabic. I'm wondering if that kind of dynamic existed back then. I mean, in the areas you studied, as in your identity is really tied up with your language.
I think that can be true. With the particular data that we have, it gets a little bit hazy because what we're working with is written documents, right? So I make a very, very important distinction between the languages that people are using to write and the languages that they are potentially speaking as vernacular at home, on the street, or whatever. So in my head, the people I'm working with are way more multilingual than they have traditionally been viewed as. So just to give you a little background then of the way multilingualism has been dealt with in the ancient world, in particular in ancient Iraq. There's a lot of politics and racism involved in it. So basically the idea has been that because cuneiform, excuse me, because cuneiform is one of the world's first written languages, written writing systems, the language associated with it gives the people who spoke that language a particular inventive power. So if the people who invented writing, so let me be very clear then, so in the way this is phrased, or at least the way it had been phrased, the people who invented writing are either Sumerian, and initially Sumerian was thought to be related to Indo-Aryan languages, or they were Babylonians, i.e. Semitic. So that sets up in the history of my field this notion that there are two competing speaking groups. One is Sumerian, one is Semitic, and associated with that were all these other indexicalities, if I might use a word from sociolinguistics, that is stereotypes related to what to expect of people who are Semitic versus people who are Indo-Aryan. And so you could imagine then that there's a little bit back and forth, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, about who invented writing and what did they do with that writing. And if they're Sumerians, well, then the Semitic people just borrowed it and stole it from them. And that is an argument that was postulated by a very, very famous German Assyriologist in 1936. And so you can imagine the political ramifications of an argument like that. Also related to that then is even post-World War II are arguments just that simply associate what people write or what people speak with their ethnicity, right? And again, you get these Sumerians versus Semites in a very concentrated clash of stereotypes, and so that's a lot of what I'm trying to break down a little bit and say, you know, I mean, most people don't really say that, hold to these views anymore. At least they don't say it out loud, or at least they'll give due credence to being a little bit more nuanced about it. But I'm arguing very, very importantly that we need to make this distinction between what people are writing and doing with writing, as opposed to the stuff we just don't know, which is the multilingual world in which they lived and breathed and worked and played and sang and mourned and whatever, is a very different world than this world of writing, which is very much confined and limited in our scope. So that was a bit of a tangent, but I hope that kind of helps you understand some of the issues I'm thinking about as I'm writing, and why some of these methodologies become very prominent in my thinking. So there is that discourse and dialogue with people who have come before.